Now, one really important concept to understand before using struts is MVC, or Model View Controller. Now, you may already be very familiar with Model View Controller. If so, you can skip this part of the course. But if not, or if you just want a quick review, we're just going to go over very quickly what MVC is. We're not going to go into too much depth here, but I do want to make sure that you do have a basic understanding of MVC because it's really a defining concept in struts. So the basic concept of model view controller, as we said before, is to separate the model from the view. And the way it does this is through a controller. So the basic idea here is that the user is going to interact with the controller. And in a web application, this is going to be a request, a web request. So it might be clicking on a button, it might be hitting a particular URL. Typically in a web application, something you do in the user interface results in some URL being called. And so now the controller is basically going to take that request from the user and it's going to pass off that request to something to handle that request. So the controller is going to decide how to map that request to something. In struts, it's called an action. But the controller is basically going to cause the manipulation of the model. And remember, the model is the logic and data. So it might be some data that you have in a database combined with some logic to manipulate that data and process business rules regarding that data. And then that model is going to cause some changes in the view. So it's going to manipulate the view. So the view is going to be based on a reflection of that model. And that view is going to be served back to the user. So when you think about how this works in a web application, maybe a request comes in, goes to the controller says, oh, who can handle this, or who should be dealing with this? It finds an appropriate action and struts, and we'll talk about action a little bit more later. But through this action, it ends up manipulating the model. It calls some code in there, which manipulates some data in a database perhaps. Maybe it adds a user, changes some feature, changes some property on some object, and then that model's changes are reflected in a view. So a view gets served up, and in our Java web application, a lot of times this view will be a JSP page that renders some data that was provided by the model. Now that view is presented to the user, and this process can start over again as the user interacts with that view. So that's really the basic concept of MVC.